What is up, guys? Welcome back to the Meaning Of Podcast, a podcast where we talk about your favorite directors and the deeper meaning within their films. And now we are talking about the hottest director currently in Hollywood, the one that is currently, I believe, projected to win the Oscar for Best Picture and maybe even Best Director, and that is Chloé Zhao, who has a new movie coming out, or came out, I believe, called Nomadland, that is currently on Hulu right now. I'm here obviously with RB3 and Sabrina, excited to talk about Chloé Zhao with you guys because she is kind of a newer director when it comes to her filmography, but I feel like there's still plenty to talk about. Sabrina, right before we came on, you told me that she won the PGA award for Nomadland as well. Let's just get that out of the way. Do we feel like she's going to win the Oscar?
I think 100%. She's probably definitely the favorite to win.
Yeah, I think RB3.
Yeah, I think the fact that she was the writer, director, producer, and one of the editors on the film, absolutely contributes to like that. I also think like the naturalistic, it's so stylistic in such a unique way, and it's so distinctly hers that I think is kind of undeniable to give her that award at this point. So
it's crazy to see her rise and her come up, right, as far as the quality of films that she makes, and obviously Nomadland isn't necessarily the most bombastic movie there is, but there is plenty there to celebrate, and I feel like that's what she does so well. Obviously, her first film, I'm going to probably butcher the name. I believe it is called Songs My Brother Taught Me. Already kind of set up everything that she currently does now. But one of the main things that Chloé Zhao is known for, and I kind of want to start this conversation with what she's known for the most, which is kind of this retelling a real life story in a fictionalized way, if that makes sense, where she takes actual actors and she kind of tells the story about these actors, but they're kind of retelling the story themselves in a slightly fictionalized way. The actor from the first movie she did, Songs My Brother Taught Me, was actually some of those elements of the story. Some of his family members were actually his actual family members. And some of the things he faced in the movie were actual things he faced growing up. What did you guys think of this like semi-docu style or like fictionalized real retelling? It's like the classic like dramatization in certain medical dramas or medical shows. I don't know if you guys have seen those that are really funny, where they're like, he lost his hand chopping up some wood, and then they show the guy and he's like, oh, I lost my hand. But it's like, it's a real story, but they're dramatizing the story. Except Chloé Zhao does it like in an actual professional way, where it's the same people acting out kind of what they went through in a slightly elevated way. What do you guys think of that style? I'll start with you, RB3.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I feel like she's definitely pioneering a certain kind of element of realism that's pushing beyond even what I would define as, you know, a lot of people would define neo-realism as what's kind of happening, but I would even take this like a step further. If you look into the behind-the-scenes stories of Songs That My Brother Taught Me, you know, the real person, as you know, who was the center of the film, Johnny, he says this is like based on like 80% of his real life. So to me, I almost look at this and I look at, and I hope to explain this further on in a video essay, hopefully sooner than later, this kind of concept that Zoe, excuse me. Sorry, my bad, y'all, my bad.
All good.
Yeah, this concept that Chloé Zhao, this concept that she is introducing in a lot of her films is kind of pushing beyond the elements of just like what's real in the narrative and what's not. It's kind of blending that lines. I kind of consider that meta realism, and I think that's something that we see in Borat. You know, for example, we see that you know, how it literally is just him being a fictionalized character interacting with real life. We also see that in a lot of her filmmaking, and I think that's something that derives from some people who inspired her. She's talked about Terrence Malick being a big inspiration on her filmmaking style, and you could definitely see that clearly throughout all of her films. But yeah, that kind of like uber embrace of naturalism, of real life, of realism, so much to the point where it's kind of blurring the lines, like you said, between documentary and narrative. I think that's something prophetic, and I think that's something so unique and powerful that that it just makes her stand out even more and more.
And even from a storytelling standpoint, I just find it to be so fascinating because she is basing these stories around real life people. Obviously, Nomadland is the only example where the main character, the protagonist, isn't a real person. In The Writer, it's the same situation as well. Same with the family, same with the character Lane Scott, who's the actual friend that the story is kind of centered around. I just find it to be so fascinating because we're diving into these worlds and ideas that we don't typically get to see. And I think it's so different from if we just saw a Lifetime film or a different type of film that actually is like a dramatic version of real life. I think this completely grounds it into like an American story. And also based off her background, I find it to be really interesting, the stuff that she centers her stories around, because she was born in China, goes to like primary school in the UK, and then goes to college in the US. And kind of the focus, because she went to school in New York too. So her focusing these stories in places like South Dakota or other places like that, something we don't typically get to see. I think she's shining a light on different ways of life, different paths that people take that we never see in a film. We never see in Oscar films. We never see in these types of ways, especially shown to a wider audience. I feel like I'm so happy that Nomadland is being talked about the way that it is, and it wasn't one of those underrated gems. People are genuinely giving its flowers as it's happening, and it's just really cool to see.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because the difference between kind of movies that have done this in the past is that usually they take actors to retell
Yeah.
stories, but in a way, she's kind of taking like actors and just like telling them like, "What's your story? How about we make a movie off that?" Similar to what The Writer is, Brady Jandrew with the accident he had with the horse. Um, and centering his actual like real life family as far as his mom and his dad and his sister, as well as like his love for horseback riding and all that kind of stuff that happens in the film, and kind of just telling this narrative version of a fictionalized of his real life story. I mean, which is kind of interesting because it's a lot of faith that you're placing inside the central key characters. Obviously, in the first film, it's Johnny, and in this one, it's Brady. But what do you think of that style as far as like bringing something so much out of the actors that you actually get an incredible performance from the leading roles?
I
Sabrina.
think there's an authenticity. There's a really special authenticity that you wouldn't normally get if it's an actor, even a really seasoned actor like Frances McDormand. She did incredible, but it's so powerful to actually see these people like Brady in this film and to realize after watching it, like he actually lived this. People like his friend Lane in the film he went through an accident and he's in the film, and then also his family. It just, even though I don't know, it brings that authenticity to it. Even though it's not actors, it just feels so real. It feels like such a lived in world, and we're completely immersed in it in that way. I feel like I'm part of the family. It feels intimate, almost like I'm listening in on like conversations that I shouldn't be between family members, like stuff about money, different financial situations, their home life, them living in poverty. It feels so like, I don't know. Whereas if we did have actors, it could be like disingenuous. It feels so authentic in this situation.
Yeah,
RB3.
and yeah, I think that authenticity is exactly what makes Chloé Zhao stand out so much in her filmmaking. I think that's what makes Nomadland hit so much harder than I think a lot of the movies that we've seen so far this year, because she's able to capture the human experience through the eyes of actual humans. Like, we're not, through the glossy, Hollywood is so used to like this glossy image of, perfect camera shots and, perfect focus and perfect lighting and, perfect sound and all of these elements that are, supposed to be, creating the illusion of escapism. But, for a lot of these people and these communities, especially in this Badlands trilogy, right, and that is kind of her defining thing between songs that my brother taught me and this and parts of No Man's Land. That's you see you see like the kind of like not much to do. I don't want to say boredom, but there's not much going on in like those kind of like deserted, kind of isolated areas, as opposed to when, you know, and I think in exploring that, you explore like the subtleties of like the actual genuine human experience. You know, like you explore like the beauty of nature, you explore the beauty of like the environment around you. And that's also something that I think is like really fascinating about her work. She kind of enters into this other lane of like neo westerns too, like, right? Because when you really think about westerns, a lot of people think westerns, they think the gunslingers and the bars, and they think about all of these other aspects of the western genre. But when you look at what a western is, the defining aspect is the time period and the iconography. And iconography is the environment around you, right? The deserts, the environment, you know, the fact that most westerns are called westerns because they take place in like Arizona, Nevada, like California, and like these dry desert, like kind of heat places. But in this, you know, it's kind of taking place in more of like the Midwest region, but still has like that empty open world, like full of mountains and plains and kind of naturally beautiful sentiment that we see in other neo-westerns like Brokeback Mountain, or just any other kind of neo-western that we've seen in recent times as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it's less plot driven and more character driven, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where it's more about what is the day-to-day life of these characters compared to what is happening in the story. Like, hey, what's happening right now? Like, what's the conflict? It's less about the conflict and more about the character and the journey, which kind of brings me to the blending of the docu-style. Let's kind of lean into that a little bit more, Sabrina, because I kind of feel like I just finished a couple documentaries recently, and I love documentaries, but the part you said about the intimacy, what is the, I guess the question I have for you is like, what is the differentiating factor between watching a quality documentary and watching a Chloé Zhao movie?
I think with a Chloé Zhao film, I feel like we're being immersed into this world even more so than a documentary through the use of like monologues and the camera work that she has, because she'll hold onto a shot really close to someone's face as they're kind of talking about something that did genuinely happen to them. And that's where I kind of get that aspect of feeling like I'm listening to a conversation that I almost shouldn't be, something that feels like a secret. And that's why she brings that like that tragedy of human life, like things that just happen in life. And in the case of the writer, it's obviously Brady having that accident and then him not being able to pursue his passion and the ups and downs he goes and the risks he takes as he's doing that. I feel like it's much more of an emotional impact rather than if we saw it from a documentary. I feel like there's just kind of a wall in a documentary, and this breaks that completely. And we're immersed into his world and his emotions.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking off of that, Sabrina, I think, you know, the dividing factor between like documentaries are made, you know, not to be perfect. They're made to be the objective reality and, you know, a supposed objective truth. Now, obviously, that objectivity is from the perspective of the filmmaker, but it's supposed to represent like an objective angle. And even down to the shooting and the cinematography of documentaries, you see that because a lot of times they have to use longer lenses in documentaries because you're literally further away from your subject. So you have to zoom in more and you have to be literally physically more distant, as opposed to like Chloé Zhao's filmography. Like you said, Sabrina, there's so many close-ups. There's so many like close-up intimate shots with short angle lenses that make you feel really close and really intimate, almost familiar with a lot of these characters, to the point where you're feeling like you're in that environment. And that same use of the short lenses makes the world around them look so much bigger and so much fuller and so much more magnificent and beautiful. And we get like those nice long like golden hour like sunsets with like the focal length spread out, you know, I mean the light, you know, spread out evenly. Like that's all part of the style. And that's all, again, I think that's reminiscent of Terrence Malick, but I think Terrence Malick is, you know, for his reputation is kind of like, you know, he's known for just kind of being like a wild goose. Like, you know, there's no really whatever. But I think with Chloé Zhao, there's a lot of preparation that goes into hers. There's a lot more precision that goes into her work, almost to a point of where there's, you know, her films are a little bit more perfect in like execution in that sense. So yeah, that's why I really dig her style, and like you said, that intimacy. I think that's the dividing factor between the documentary, though, is that, you know, you have the option to get up close and you have the option to get in the face of these people. So
Yeah, before we go to break, let's quickly talk about her, kind of going off that, the cinematography of all her work kind of has a through line, but at the same time, um, it's all pretty unique to what the subject is and what the story is. How much credit do you think Chloe Zhao deserves for those incredible shots and um, the way she the kind of shots she selects and the way she chooses to kind of stay on those shots, Sabrina? Like, do you feel like that's like a Chloe Zhao thing, or do you feel like maybe it might be more the DP kind of flexing?
I feel like I do give her a lot of credit for this because she's, first of all, the one that kind of stumbles upon these subjects or these topics that she wants to discuss. I believe she met Brady from the writer in like a grocery store or something like that, and she just heard his story. So I think through that, she gets to know them on a personal level, so much so as to tell their story and keep it mostly realistic, but also just very, very entertaining. And that's why I kind of give her credit for that, because I feel like she's so personal with her subjects that she wants us to be as well, and she wants the camera to be as well. And that's why I feel like, in the difference of like sitting there in a scene with Brady, his father, and his sister, and through their interactions, getting to know them based off of the way that they talk to each other, versus like a documentary where it'd be people sitting down in front of a camera or stuff that they'd be aware that a camera's there. This feels like that's obviously not the case, but it's so real at the same time. It's like you're looking through a lens of this family. So I do give her a lot of credit because of the way that she stumbles upon her subjects, but obviously like the DP as well. And
yeah, and like I think you just said it like so eloquently. I think like the fact that as a filmmaker, you have like the choice to be like close. You have the choice to be kind of like distinctly, you know, entrenched in like the stories of these peoples and their life. Like they're like, for some filmmakers, it would have just been easy to like talk to these people and then go off back to Hollywood and like find some inspiration to write a script like on their own, you know. But for someone like Chloe Zhao, she literally involves herself so deeply into the subject matter that she's just retelling their story from their perspective. And I think that's really bold. I think that's really intriguing and investigative. And I think in doing so, she's finding, I mean, I'm sure there's like a sense of discovery within herself, right? Like I'm sure there's a sense of like finding herself in a lot of these subject matters, and that kind of like endless soul searching, which I think is a theme that like is pretty prevalent throughout all three of her films, like the kind of endless soul searching.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Let's go to break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Chloe Zhao's work.
This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. With the 4/5 divide you in half. You getting at me equals a club half. You do the math, take you out the equation. This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh.
Did you watch the new Disney Plus and MCU show Falcon and the Winter Soldier? If you're on the fence, check out my non-spoiler review available exclusively on First Cut. Here's a clip. Enjoy. And you start off with an opening sequence where you follow Falcon doing his work and flying, and you know, I'm guessing part of the military. And this is one of the dopest sequences ever. Like, we've seen dogfights on film, we've seen flying scenes on film, but we've never seen nothing like this. And to start the show off with such a hot favor of action, fun, literally right off the top, it's like, yo, this is crazy. And they get mad creative with it too. It's not like something that, you know, is generic or something we've seen all over the place. No, this feels like something that might have been in like a video game, or just could be something really, really cool and original that we just haven't seen on a movie screen. And then we actually follow a lot of the characters. We actually follow Falcon and Winter Soldier and their lifestyles post Endgame, how they're adjusting to life, how they're living life. We meet Falcon's lifestyle, and we get to see the kind of struggles he deals with. We actually learn that he's, you know, from the South, and he has a family who has a struggling boat business, and he's trying to make it work, you know, financially. But then you kind of learn, you know, hey, like, you know, what's kind of the financial situation for the Avengers? Do they even get paid? That was always a question I had personally. They kind of talk about that a little bit.
Check out our new website on geeksofcolor.co/first-cut to check out our reviews, our videos, and articles that pertain to everything First Cut related. Check it out.
Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
What is up, guys? We're back talking about Chloé Zhao. Now let's talk a little bit more about her editing in her film. Something that you pointed out, RB3, is that she actually is credited as the editor for her new film, Nomadland. What do you think of, obviously, her editing style, but also the fact that she's able to do both directing and editing? That's something that's not as common as it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there's very few directors who actually contribute to both of those, you know, both of those aspects, right? Like we see sometimes with the Coen brothers, maybe, you know, but they're a duo. And we also saw like James Cameron also edit like films like Titanic, and he's also, but he also had like 4 other editors with him. But Chloé Zhao, she's literally doing it all of herself, and this is representative of like her fullest vision, like all put together. Like, and you can kind of tell how meticulously kind of the shots and the sequencing of the entire movie was kind of planned out in a way that flowed really, really smoothly, which I think felt seamless. Like it felt like I didn't feel like I was being overwhelmed with cuts or being overwhelmed with like showing long takes or anything like that. It just felt so naturalistic and so smooth and put together. Like, you know, I just felt it. It just felt like I was being a part of this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit over to obviously her new film Nomadland, Sabrina, but I also kind of want to talk about the way that certain movies are placed in certain times, and obviously the subject matter, and why critically they start to rise towards the surface. Nomadland is obviously about someone who lives this nomadic lifestyle in the US, goes from job to job. But I'm curious, why do you think this movie right now is hitting so hard for critically as far as being the best picture of the year?
This film takes place after the recession, and there was obviously so much loss throughout this entire country. And I feel like we're almost in a similar position right now. With this pandemic over the last year, so many people have lost jobs. So many people have gone through this hardship. And I think it's that idea of like breaking down our perception of the American dream and what we believe is living our best life, the directions that we want to go with in life. Obviously, she's working in Nomadland, she's working like a factory job, but she's living, when she's not doing that, she's living most of her time in an RV on the land with the nomads. And that's a completely different lifestyle than something I've ever been introduced to, especially not in this way. And so I feel like, again, it's that idea of like the tragedy of being a human, the things that we have to go through and how real it is, because anything can change at any moment. And I feel like this is genuinely a perfect time coming kind of out of the pandemic, over the next few months. I feel like a lot of people are finding their solace in this character, and obviously having Frances McDormand as the main actress, like she just always gives such an incredible performance. And this is one of the situations where I'm happy that she is telling this story, and a lot of the supporting actors are the real nomads, because their stories are even more interesting than somebody who is like new to the nomad life as Frances McDormand's character is.
What do you think, RB3?
Yeah, I think focusing on this, on the nomad, I think for one, we're talking about why this hits like today. I think particularly in 2020, this has been like a real soul searching like time period, you know, being stuck in like a pandemic, being stuck in a quarantine. We've been forced to like look in the mirrors a lot. We've been forced to like be stuck in our own lives and like in our own reflections, and like what are we working towards? What are we doing? What's our purpose in life? And I think the question of like, what's your purpose is something that's so universal throughout all three of her films, right? Songs That My Brother Taught Me is about, you know, the dude Johnny. He's really just living in this reservation aimlessly and not knowing what to do, and he's just getting in trouble for it. And I think that's the same thing that happens, you know, frankly, to people who in today like live in, you know, from like LA, but they move out to like Rialto or like Victorville or somewhere like, you know, nowhere lives, and then they just get bored and start getting high all the time. And then the same thing happens with the writer. Like, you know, he loses his literal ability to write. Like, he loses his purpose, what he thinks his actual goal is in life, to who he is, who he actually is. It's almost like Sound of Metal a little bit, that came out this year. You know, in that same way, like, what do you do after you lose the thing that you love most about yourself and about the world? And then in No Man's Land, it's like, what is her purpose anyway? Like, what is her, like, why is she on this this nomad journey? Is she like running from something, or is she looking for something? And it's like she's continuing to be on like this endless search. You know, and you know, we see throughout this film, she talks about how she just can't stay like locked up. She just can't stay in one place for too long. She did that for a long period of time, and she just wants to stop doing it. So it's a really fascinating exploration of purpose, of, you know, individuality. I think that's the central human question that a lot of people have, and I think this is probably the film that makes it like the most relatable and probably the most like commercially accessible for a lot of audiences. So
I guess my follow-up to you, RB3, and I'll toss it to Sabrina as well, is why these sections of the country? Why, you know, for the writer, why Brady's story, why Johnny's story, and why Fern's story? Do you feel like that has a certain effect, or that has a certain quality as far as how it's being received?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think for me, like, you know, when well, I think having Vern being like a white woman definitely makes it a little more like easier, you know, for like outsiders who don't understand like native culture, or for people who don't necessarily understand cowboy culture. Vern's story, she's kind of like a blank slate. Like, you don't really know much about her just in general. Like, she just kind of is like herself, like, and you don't really see much like past that. So whereas I think I think it was a very intentional choice of having someone white and like have it be like a white woman like Frances McDormand be the main character in this, because it's you know, if it was other races or any other kind of community, it would just be seen as like a poverty film or like a race film, you know, exploitation of like racial poverty and stuff like that. But I think having somebody who's like, as, you know, as perceived by at least like America, not at least not actually who's quote unquote American, but was perceived as the most American person in the world, like Frances McDormand, you know, just lovable, happy, you know, Fargo lady, you know, seeing her in this part, it just makes it feel like anybody and everybody could be a part of this, because it is something that's so universal. It is something that is not a thing that's necessarily tied to poverty all the time. For some people it is, and for some people that's an unfortunate reality. But for people like Frances McDormand, you could be black, white, Asian, or whatever, and still live this lifestyle. But I think having it just be with somebody like Frances McDormand just makes it more universal. It's like Tom Hanks. It's like the cheat code to having, like, you know, a more relatable person be a part of it.
I mean, the complexities of that answer is kind of insane, RB3, because you really want to question the idea of saying the most relatable thing you can think of is a white woman. But it kind of is true. Yeah. What does that say about us, though, as an audience and as a country? Sabrina, or RB3, I'll let you talk, and then I'll
Sabrina, Sabrina, you go.
Are you sure? I mean, you can finish. I mean, that 100%, it really does, you know, with something like this, it's like having Frances McDormand. First of all, everyone's going to talk about this performance. Frances McDormand isn't anything, and people are going to talk about this performance. Your film is going to be put on the map. Whereas where you have Brady, who is an actual, just real life used to be a writer, it might fall under the radar for some people. But then you hear, oh, Frances McDormand's new film, she was great in 3 Billboards, she was great in Fargo. So then of course that's going to kind of entice people to see this, and it does add that factor of she's very recognizable. She has been in so much, even if like a casual movie-going like audience member doesn't know her name, you know her face, and then you're intrigued to watch this film. So I do think that. And then also what RB3 said kind of about, you know, it's this white woman that lives in the middle of nowhere. She lost her job. She lost her husband. She takes like a seasonal job at Amazon. It just makes the story a lot more relatable to a larger audience. And then it does take away that idea of, it's almost more empowering and uplifting, rather than, unfortunately, if it were to be like a Mexican American or something like that, it would be more of a poverty film.
Yeah, and it's sad because that's not like the reality of it. I think for a lot of people that's not the case, but I think the perception is different than what reality is. And there's a deeper conversation we could get into about Hollywood brainwashing, about like how we've been conditioned to think certain ways about certain races and certain things. So when we see a vagrant black man on a screen, we don't think he's, you know, making that choice like voluntarily. We just think he's just being homeless because he's too poor. Like that's just the automatic assumption that's just built from generations. But whatever, that's a whole separate conversation.
And
right?
I don't think Chloé Zhao is like, that was her intention at all. I think she might have gotten into a conversation with a few people and then maybe met up with Frances McDormand for that reason and you know, had given her.
You don't think it's intentional? Do you think? Well, I mean, as far as her being like a white, because I think it is intentional as far as like maybe that she kind of does go out of her way to be like, I'm gonna tell a white people story.
Well, it's not. I don't think it's I don't think it's a white people story though. I think it's
no, not necessarily with specifically Nomadland. I mean, like in general, like the writer Nomadland. It feels like she's very much telling this typical like, you know, blue collar, white working class.
I think it's her not being an American. I think it's her being from China and then having, and the writer is a similar situation where it's about the American dream. These people are living in poverty. I think it's almost a fascination of the ideas of the American dream and American society as a whole, rather than her wanting to tell like white, quote unquote, like white people stories. And it is really interesting because I know she talked about a few of her favorite filmmakers of all time. The first filmmaker that made her want to make films was Wong Kar-wai, the amazing Chinese director. And then Spike Lee taught a class that she was at the NYU like Tisch School of the Arts. So that was another director. And there's a few directors that she cites, also Ang Lee. And it's so interesting how her filmography is so different, because obviously she also mentions Terrence Malick, but her filmography is so different from like Wong Kar-wai or something like that, where they're telling Asian stories. They're setting all of these films. He's setting these films in China and he's focusing on big theatrics, dramatics, all of that kind of stuff. And hers is so patient, quiet, and she's focusing on American lifestyles. Yeah. I do feel it's definitely purposeful in that way, but I feel like it's more of maybe a fascination of the American dream and American society rather than like white people stories.
Yeah. Because to me, I just find it kind of fascinating the way, especially the way Hollywood is going now. I mean, obviously I can open up a little bit more as far as behind the scenes on a personal level, like the conversations I have with my brother. He's also a filmmaker or, you know, a filmmaker currently working in Hollywood, who makes, you know, small stuff, small commercial stuff like that, obviously hoping to make feature films. But the way we have discussions as far as how we want to frame our stories and how the way Hollywood integrates stories of people of color who are behind the camera. For example, me being a Latino, it's like, hey, are you ready to tell this Latino story? Which should be the way it is. But at the same time, how does it happen when my brother is like, yeah, but I don't want to make just Latino stories. I want to make other stuff too that feature other people. How does Hollywood come to terms with that? Because I don't think they have so far. I think they just get confused by that concept. They're like, what? How is that possible? And it's totally possible, and you totally can do it. I just find it fascinating that Chloé Zhao, a woman of color, specifically an Asian woman, is telling these stories, number one. Number two, how do you think this is just a generalization, and obviously we can only do generalizations, but how do you think people of color will react to these movies if we're being on an honest, real level? What do you think, RB3?
Well, first of all, I want to say there's no other braver director stepping outside of telling his, films about race than Tim Story directing the new Tom and Jerry movie. I mean, that's absolutely amazing.
It's a cat and it's a mouse.
Yeah, what a journey from the black struggles of barbershop to now Tom and Jerry. Absolutely crazy. But yeah, going like, what was your question again?
You had to put in the Tom and Jerry bit.
Yeah, and I'm over here talking about racist.
I love it.
I said, like, how do you think, like, generally, if we're being real, how do you think people of color react to these movies or watch these movies, or if they even watch these movies?
Oh, so yeah, that's what's interesting, because I have a really tough time, like, convincing, like, my mom or, like, my girlfriend to, like, really want to watch this movie, because they see, like, it's just about, like, a white nomad, living their thing. And
that's like, kind of my point, right? Is this really reaching that audience at all?
Well, I mean, I think there's like gaps in, like, there's gaps in what we consider and perceive as, like, acceptable art and not acceptable art for different people in different ways. For me, this movie is just as explorative and as vast and as remarkable as something like a Queen and Slim. Now, even though Queen and Slim deals with, like, much heavier subject matter when it comes to, like, police brutality, racism, police killings, it still has that like beautiful American, like, visual landscape, like, kind of idea to it. But because there's black characters behind it, it's automatically considered a black film. It doesn't give, like, any kind of recognition anywhere. Nor does, but because this has a certain, like, kind of, like, level of accessibility, Nomadland does, at least, it gets a lot more award recognition. But I also think it makes it a little more, like we talked about, a little more universal, a little more easier to digest as something that's not specific to race. But I do think, I think people, I think what, for me, my hook to people of color, or for people of color who want to watch this movie and think it's, like, not relatable or whatever, is that, I think the human experience of, like, just living life, of just finding your purpose, exploring your purpose, is something we've seen in our cinema, like in black cinema and Asian cinema and Latino cinema, like, all throughout generations, but like, and inherently, like, we come, like, disillusioned with, like, the American dream, and, like, what does that even, like, really mean? But I think if you really want a movie that, like, actually, like, honestly and earnestly explores that, this would definitely, like, be that movie. I think if you, like, subbed out Frances McDormand and were to make it, I don't know, like Viola Davis, or like Salma Hayek or something else, or somebody like that, like, it would have been, you still would have gotten the same quality of story regardless. So I don't know. Then why does it have to be a white chick? Why does it have to be a white lady? I don't think it has to be.
Well, I mean, you said if it's more relatable that way.
I don't think it's more relatable. I don't think it's more relatable. I don't think it's more relatable necessarily. I think it's more like, I might have said relatable, but what I'm saying is that it makes it easy for the idea of, like, the conception of, like, the American dream, the American world. Like, there's already a kind of disassociation and distrust that a lot of racial groups have towards the American dream and the American idea preemptively, just based on our experiences in this country already. Yeah. It's already kind of tough to buy into that subject matter, like, off the bat, so when it comes to like our representation on film, there's an extra level of, like, cynicism, like, or is it just white Hollywood trying to tell us again to be more like The Help, or be more like, The Color Purple, or, like, all these other, like, discouraging films? Or is it some like tragedy porn, like, you know, that I got to sit through and suffer through for another 2 hours? There's not a lot of options. There's maybe a few. There's maybe Black Panther, there's maybe Creed, and there's maybe a couple others. But there's not a lot of positive examples of cinema out there. So I think when it comes to like exploring like this openness of a lifestyle, there's not a lot of Black people who could personally relate to like being nomads. But I think there's a universal human relationship to soul searching and looking for yourself. So,
but do you feel like that maybe necessarily is based on also the idea of alienating white audiences if they did make it about a Black person?
I mean, yeah, that's something that I'm sure even, that's something that literally even Obama has talked about in Mad Times. He's talked about how it's hard for him to get racially motivated, not racially motivated, but policies that pertain to race, like affirmative action or like reparations across in politics, because there is this idea of like alienating white people. And I think what this movie at least explores, and I think I think there are some other great movies that explore, is that, yeah, there's not just white people who are just poor. Like, there's not just Black people who are poor. There's white people who are poor. There's white people who don't have it figured out. There's white people who aren't living in $1 million mansions that you see in every single movie. There's white people who are just literally out there just trying to get it and figure themselves out as much as we are. So I think that is something that should be seen across the world and should be universal. And I think somebody like Chloé Zhao telling that story actually does help that happen, because her sense of like relatability, her sense of like understanding audiences and emotions and tapping into that really deeply, I think is just so satisfying and deep that I think it could resonate on all levels with a lot of people.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Sabrina? The idea of how does this translate to audiences that are not white people?
Yeah, I do understand that idea of like, oh, why would I want to watch like a group of white people just like struggle for like 2 hours or what? But I think it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about this is a completely untapped territory that I knew nothing about. I knew absolutely nothing about this. I think like it kind of just sheds a light on something that genuinely is so interesting, because it does happen and people do live their lives this way, and they document it now, like on the internet, through blogs, on YouTube, and on all of that. So I think it's an interesting look into a completely different lifestyle. And I don't know. I feel like Chloé Zhao, because she talks about a lot about like her Chinese upbringing. So how she's completely detached. Like she says, like, I'm not American, even though I've been here since like grad school at college. She's like, I'm not American. She kind of just, the way that she talks about her upbringing in China as well. She talks about like high suicide rates in teenagers in China, and how about like the education and how rebellious she was against that. And then when she went to England, a lot of that changed because she learned a lot about China's history. And I think it's just, again, that fascination, because she says like when she did come to America and she did travel around, she was just fascinated with another version of life. That's something so outside of like her perception. And it's through obviously like the people she hired in Nomad Land, the real life nomads, a lot of famous ones through this community, and just like hearing their stories. So I don't think, I understand that this wouldn't be, overall, I feel like this isn't the easiest movie to sell in general to an average audience. Like if it's just like, this is a very quiet, patient story about the human condition and tragedies of life and pursuing something more, and post-recession in America. I feel like it might not appeal to a super wide audience, but it kind of does get that, that Oscar nudge because of Frances McDormand. Also, Chloé Zhao, I had actually never heard of Chloé Zhao until she was announced as the director for Eternals. And I am a huge lover of independent films, and the writer just completely flew under my radar. So something like this, her being announced for Eternals, this film coming out in perfect time, I just feel like is putting her on the map for a lot more people. And that's obviously due to her amazing direction in this film, but also like Frances McDormand being in it, and the hype being 100% there, because the writer was a lot smaller. It only premiered at like one theater in the US or something like that.
Yeah, it really does paint an interesting picture as far as where do we see Chloe Zhao go from here as far as her storytelling goes and how that translates to a story that isn't centered around like what'd you call the trilogy RB3?
Balance trilogy.
Badlands trilogy. So it's not necessarily the similar type of storytelling, similar setting, similar kind of one character driven story. It's going to be a much more larger story, obviously, with Eternals. So I'm so curious to see what she does in the future. Any final thoughts on Chloe Zhao RB3?
Yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly excited for Eternals. I've heard. Well, no, I mean, I say that. I'm incredibly excited for Eternals. I think this is, I'm so curious to see how her sense of like naturalism and meta realism is going to fit into the Marvel universe. It's kind of funny because, and I feel like, we gone from her kind of making like semi film narrative / documentaries to going to the most fantasistical, like, Eternals thing. I'm just so curious to see how that's going to work out, but I'm really excited for it.
It's a little different from, I was going to say, well, there's been a few, right? There's been James Gunn, there's been Taika Waititi, there's been Ryan Coogler. But even all those don't feel like as indie
Just Daniel Cretton, short term 12. That's a small one for Shang-Chi. Obviously, we haven't seen that one yet,
but this one still feels like the most indie director ever directing an MCU film. Even though I just named like 5 indie directors, I'm totally with you, RB3. I'm so curious. Yeah, what do you think?
I do agree 100%, but it also takes me back, and this is what makes me even more excited, is about her citing that Wong Kar-wai was the director that made her get into films in general, because he is obviously telling much larger stories and definitely very stylistic. So I'm excited to see how this kind of translates over to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I'm sure at this point that she's pretty much a lock for the Oscar, and I'm excited. Obviously, we're going to be talking about all of that going forward, but I mean, she's the second woman to ever win Best Director at the Golden Globes, first Asian woman. So, I mean, she's really getting she's getting a lot of attention, not just in terms of her directing Eternals, but with what she did with Nomadland, and deservingly so.
Yeah, I'm obviously super excited to see what she does next after Eternals and Eternals itself. It's going to be a lot of fun. Sabrina, where can everyone find you?
Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at SabrinaXMonica, and then also on Twitter at SabrinaOnFilm.
RB3.
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at DirectorRB3.
Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Meaning of Podcast. Please subscribe here if you haven't done so already on First Cut. You can follow us on Spotify and on iTunes as well. You can follow me at Squad Leader Race, and you can follow our channel's official social media account, which is First Cut TMO. Alrighty, guys, for the First Cut crew, we're peacing out.